Good morning,
Rabbi.
We're learning Mishnayos Chagiga, Perek Beis, Chapter 2, Mishnah Zayin, Mishnah 7. Okay, now before we start, there are certain people who are tamei that when they put their weight on something, they turn into what's called a medras. If someone's a zav, a zava, a nida, different type of situations, there are emissions from the body, or even someone, zav, zava, nida, women after childbirth. In all these situations, if they put their weight on something, they sit on something, lay down on something, they lean on something, they turn into what's called a midras. And a midras has a unique quality to it that typically if someone is a avatuma, they're the original source of tuma, and they touch something else, then the next thing becomes a rishon, it becomes a first degree, it goes down a step. By a medras, the zav is an avatuma, and what he puts his weight on is also an avatuma. Doesn't go down a level, it becomes just like him. And now that a medras has the power as an avatuma to actually make a person tamei and to make utensils tamei. If something goes down to a rishon, to a first degree, it doesn't do that. So a medras has that unique power to it that it becomes the status of an avatuma, which can make people and utensils tamei. Okay. Now, we've been discussing until now how there are different categories of sanctity. You have chulin, regular food, you have meiser sheni, you have truma, you have carbon meat, you have the paraduma water, and each one is considered holier than the next one, and therefore each one is treated in a certain way. So now we're going to have another example of how these different levels, how they distinguish themselves. So the Mishnah reads, Bigdei Am Haaretz, the clothing of an Am Haaretz. Am Haaretz will just translate now literally as a person who is ignorant. Medras leprushim is considered a medras for perushim. Now, in this context, when we talk about an Am Haaretz and Prushim, we mean like this. Prushim, which is the word that was used for sages, in contrast to the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, you have the Prushim. But Prushim means scholars, is a title for scholars. And this is used in this context to say something we mentioned previously, which is these are people who will only eat even their regular food in a state of purity. You can't eat meiser sheni if it's impure. You can't eat truma if it's impure. Ordinary food, if it's impure, you may eat it. But there were people who were strict, and they would not eat any food unless that food was pure. That's what the prushim are. People who are strict, then when it comes to their even their regular food, they make sure that it's tar, that it's pure. Now, an Am Haaretz is a person who does not keep that. It doesn't mean that they're not completely ignorant, but they're not strict when it comes to that practice of eating their regular food and to make sure it's pure when they eat it. And because of that, and it's to a certain degree, because they're not as strict about purity and impurity as the Prushim are, so in comparison to the Prushim, they're not as careful with purity and impurity as the Prushim are. Okay, which means that, therefore, the Chachamim said like this: if you have an Am Haaretz, again, the person who is not strict about eating his ordinary food, and make sure that his ordinary food is pure. So we say that a garment that comes from his house, for the parish, for the person who is strict, that garment has to be considered a medras. Why? Because it could have been, just to give it a possibility, the understanding, like, why should it be a medras? Well, if this person's wife was a nida, and she sat down on this garment, then it would become a medras. So the sages gave, again, the same, because of that, because we see they're more strict from one level to the other level, as mentioned before. So therefore, if you have a garment of a person who is not careful about eating the chulin and to make sure the chulin is pure, his garment is considered rabbinically like a medras for the parish. So that means that if the person who is strict about eating the food only in a state of purity, if he were to touch the garment of this Amma Aretz, rabbinically he'd be considered an avatum, he'd be considered tameh. And he'd have to go to the mikveh before he's going to go ahead and do his thing and eat his chulin in a state of purity. Because we have to, this is how far the Chachamim went when it came to upholding the standards of purity that we mentioned before. So therefore, if let's say the parish touches the garment of the Amma Aretz, or one of his utensils touches the garment of the Amma Aretz, they now get the status of an avatuma, and they can make other things tameh in their house, which is really what they don't want to do, because they're very careful with those things. So therefore, that's the first part of the Mishnah. The garment of an Amma Aretz is considered a medrash for the prushim. Now, the next Mishnah, the Mishnah continues, continues, so to speak, going up the ladder. Big day prushim, the garments of prushim, medrash la'echlei truma. They are considered a medrash for those who eat truma. Now, those who eat truma, because it's truma and it's forbidden for truma to become asur, they are clearly going to be more careful about the laws of purity and impurity in their homes because they got to deal with truma. And therefore, because of the fact that there is a higher standard when it comes to to watching truma from becoming impure, so therefore, the garment of a parish, the garment of the person who is careful not to eat his ordinary food in a state of purity, but again, chulin, to keep your chulin pure, to keep your truma pure, it's very different. Truma is at a higher level; it's not allowed to become impure, and the guarding that's involved in that is more significant. And again, the Chachamim want to make these different levels when it comes to the different levels of the food. So therefore, they went as far as to say, you have this parish. He's a very righteous man, right? He's not eating his ordinary food unless it's pure. Nonetheless, his garment for someone who eats truma, a kohen, in other words, who eats truma, if the kohen were to touch the garment of the parish, he's in trouble. It's considered like a medrash for him, and it becomes impure. Now, what's important to point out is that if you remember, the levels go chulin, ordinary food, ma'aser sheni, and then truma. And here we skipped from the garments of prushim to those who eat truma. I mean, we skipped a level. It really should say, and the Gemara says, actually, you got to add a line in. The Mishnah is missing. The Mishnah has to really read, the garment of a parish is a medrash to someone who was eating ma'aser sheni, and the garment of a person who eats ma'aser sheni is considered a medrash for someone who eats truma. That's the way you have to read the Mishnah. The Mishnah continues, big day oichlei teruma, the garments of those who eat truma. Right? They eat truma. They're very careful about the laws of tum and tahara. Medrash l'kodesh is considered a medrash for someone who's going to eat sacrifice meat. Someone who's going to planning on eating sacrifice meat, if he touches the garment of a kohen, then, as we said before, he's in trouble. In the sense that rabbinically he's considered an avatuma because the garment of the person who ate truma is considered a medrash for this person who's going to eat something at a higher level. And again, the just to give it an understanding of how could it possibly be a medrash, the answer is, well, if the man's wife, when she was a nida, sat on this garment, then she makes it a medrash. Okay. So okay. And then the last part is big day kodesh, the garments of someone who is eating a carbon meat, medrash l'chatas, consider a medrash for someone who's going to be handling the paraduma water. If you're planning on handling the paraduma water, and you came into contact with the garment of someone who's going to eat a sacrifice, who is on the highest standard of guarding himself from truma, and this is considered the highest standard of being careful from truma. This is considered the highest level of watching for tuma from impurity. A person is going to be eating kodesh. This is a very high level. Nonetheless, that person's garment is a medrash for the person who's going to handle the paraduma water. Now, to stress the point, to bring out the point greater, the Mishnah says like this: Yosef ben Yoezer. There was a sage. His name was Yosef, the son of Yoezer. Hayachasid shebekahuna. he was the most pious Kohen. Most pious Kohen, right? You can imagine he was careful about making sure that he didn't become tamei. You could assume that in his house, he was very careful about everything. You shouldn't have to worry about anything in his house. He was a chasher bechuna vaisa mitpachtoi, and his handkerchief, which means something that he could have spread on a cushion to lie down on or to sit on. Medrash l'kodesh. His garment is a medrash for someone who wants to eat a carbon. No exceptions to this rule. When the sages made this rule, it didn't make a difference who the person was. He could have been the biggest tzaddik of the Kohanim, who clearly is someone who is cleared very much careful about truma. That's for sure. He's very careful about truma. I'm sure his home was he was very careful. Nonetheless, his garment is considered a medrash for someone who's going to eat a carbon, because any Kohen, we see him in the state of being careful to make sure to eat truma because that's what he eats. But a carbon is something you do is a different scenario, is a different situation. And therefore, being that he has, the rule is, if you are watching from truma, that doesn't help you for kodesh, for a sacrifice. And therefore, his garment was a medrash for someone who's going to eat a sacrifice. Next, Yochanan ben Gudgada. There was another sage. His name was Yochanan, the son of Gudgada. His entire life, when he ate regular food, he treated it and he was careful with it as if it was a carbon meat. That's how careful he was. All the stringencies that are kept when it comes to carbon meat, all the stringencies that we have, he did it when it came to eating his regular food. Which I understand is, for instance, we learned a couple of days ago that if you're going to go ahead and you're going to handle kodesh, if you're going to handle kodesh meat, you're going to handle a sacrifice, and you have unwashed hands, what do you got to do to be able to touch it? You got to toivel your hands. You got to put your hands in a mikveh. That's what he did with his regular food. That's how careful he was. Nonetheless, and nonetheless, his handkerchief, his garment, was a medrash for someone who wanted to touch the paraduma water. If you wanted to handle the paraduma water, Yochanan ben Gudgada, who he made sure he treated everything like a carbon, his garment, when it came to someone who wants to handle the paraduma water, was considered a medrash. That's how far the Rabbanan established this rule. Now, it's interesting to point out, very interesting to point out, is that the Mishnah says he ate his food like a carbon, treated it like a carbon, and his garment was a medrash for someone who wanted to handle paraduma water. What about his garment for someone who wanted to handle a carbon? What about that? Did that person was his garment considered a medrash for him? The Mishnah says that he ate his food like a carbon, regular food like a carbon, treated like a carbon. His garment is a medrash for handling paraduma water. That implies that it's about paraduma water, not less. That when it comes to, if such a person who wanted to handle a carbon, if that person touched his garment, he wouldn't be considered a medrash, even though the actual food that he was dealing with was not a carbon, because he was treating his regular food like a carbon, which means that our Mishnah holds that, again, regarding the laws of Tum and Tahara, laws of purity and impurity, a person who treats his regular food like a carbon, we consider it like a carbon. And therefore, his garment is not considered tamei regarding someone who wants to eat a carbon. For someone on the highest level, which is who wants to touch the paraduma water, no, for that person it is considered a medrash. But for a carbon, even though it wasn't actually a carbon what he was being careful with, but he treated it like a carbon, then we give it the full status like a carbon, and his garment would not be considered a medrash for that person, another person who wanted to touch a carbon. That's what this Mishnah holds. But it says we don't follow that opinion, but that is what this Mishnah clearly is following. Okay, let's do the Chofetz Chaim. The prohibition of speaking lashon hara, who afilu im einem avar beis hasipar or seishim medaber alav. Even when he tells a story, he is not specifying who he's talking about. Rakum Mesaper Stam, he just tells a story. There was a guy who, did this and this. Umitoich inyan asiper, but from the story itself, people can figure out Nishma l'shomei al eiz ish kivan ha'mesaper hazeh. The person who heard it figures out who he's talking about. He hears the story, hears the details, he knows exactly who he's talking about. So when I said Lashon Hara, I didn't say who it was. I said a story without mentioning anybody's name. But it was understood from the story who I was talking about. B'chlal Lashon Harahu, this is considered Lashon Hara. The Yosim is even more. Shafilu and B'divrei Sipura lo yhaya shem inyan gnai klal. Let's say he told a story. There is nothing, he didn't say anything negative in what he said. Rakshal yedei devarav nisabev ra agnus l'chaveiroi. But somehow or another, his words still caused, and that was your intention, it still caused some kind of damage or embarrassment to the person. And that's was his intention. I didn't say anything wrong, but you knew that what you were going to say was now going to bring about that someone would be discredited in some way or embarrassed. This is also considered Lashon Hara. Chazal called that Lashon Hara in private, sneaky Lashon Hara, quiet, private Lashon Hara, hidden Lashon Hara. That's the word, hidden Lashon Hara. I didn't say anything wrong, but it's hidden because that's what's going to come out of it. So if you can indulge me for a second, years ago I was reading a book about the laws of Lashon Hara, and the example for giving this was the following. There was a person. He worked he was a worker amongst different workers in a factory, and his name was Mr. Spinchy. Mr. Spinchy, and he wasn't at work. So the other workers, wanted to to notice he wasn't at work, and they wanted mention what they wanted to bring to the attention of the foreman that he's missing from work today. That he couldn't just say hey, Spinchy's missing from work. So one guy said to the other guy, what do you have for lunch today? And he said, what my lunch today? Spinach. I have spinach today. Lots and lots of spinach. And the foreman here is spinach. Hey, where's Spinchy? And that was your intention? Did I say anything wrong? I just said I have spinach for lunch. Didn't say anything wrong. But your intention was to bring about that this other person should be put down or get in trouble because of it. That's called Lashon Hara. Have a wonderful day.
Okay. I got a question.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My question